Okay, back in my basement again for another snow day. So maybe we'll see each other on Thursday. I hope so. Those of you that are watching this, I appreciate all of you wanting to know when you need to turn your yellow sheets in. Please just hold it all and put it in my hands when we finally get back. I dislike grading all that stuff on Canvas because it's hard for me to see. And no matter how I blow it up, I can't ever read it that well. So this is one time procrastination is paying off for you people. But whatever day we finally return to class, which I'm hoping now it's Thursday, you just put it in my hot hand. And I appreciate all of you being concerned about it. I'm not going to count it late. I'm not going to do any of those things. So, first order of business is all of you that did your assignments today. You finished the movie ticket before, like, I'm recording this at 8 o'clock. So I can have your questions. You took your quiz. Yay. You guys had excellent questions, which I'm glad I did this because I always feel like I explain things really well, but evidently I don't. So there was a lot of questions about why didn't the government do anything? So let's remember a couple of things about what the government is like at this point. And I think it's important to understand that the senators are not elected by the people yet. Senators are still appointed. And so, what happens with most of those senators is their pockets are lined by people like Rockefeller. They are being paid to turn a blind eye to what is happening. And that's why when we get to our next group that's going to try to change all this, our progressives and our populists, one of the first things they're going to say is we need to elect those senators so they don't have any financial interest. Currently, progressives now in Congress are also calling on things like not allowing senators or representatives to participate in the stock market while they're being elected officials to kind of alleviate that same um, um, idea of perhaps some corruption. But that's why the government couldn't change anything because the upper house was appointed by these people, by state legislators, and state legislatures were controlled by people like Mr. Rockefeller, who paid people to not to vote his way or to not vote his way. Um, I like this question. How did Rockefeller go down? I'm assuming you meant how did he lose his money and why isn't he as powerful? Well, couple things about that one, and I don't want to go too far because I could talk about that for 45 minutes. He didn't. When he died, he was worth a lot of money. And what happens quite often with people who have a lot of money, their children don't really have the same work ethic. And quite honestly, what happened to Rockefeller and all his money is his children spent a lot of it. And um, yeah. Now, they still have a lot of money, right? 30 Rockefeller, that's built by the Rockefellers. They definitely don't have the prestige that they did. And of course, really trusts are going to be busted up when we get to our populists and our progressives. And so Standard Oil will be busted up, which will allow all these other oil companies that we know. But yeah, if you want to read the Rockefellers, they're an interesting, very interesting group of people. Crazy, crazy, crazy people. So, let's see. I got why did it take so long for what other businesses did Rockefeller have? He really only had oil. He started in ferries, right? That's how he builds up his money. But once he got into oil, really that's the main part and buying stuff. He bought lots of stuff. Like they owned entire city blocks in New York City. And a lot of you were perplexed by the religion thing. And I will remind you, those of you that had AP Euro with me, is that's how kings controlled their countries for a very long period of time. I'm divine and I'm from God. I'm sent for God. People use religion for a lot of different reasons. And that reason was something that was very easy for rich people to do. Not all rich people, but that's social gospel. So thanks for those questions. If there's any other ones that maybe you guys are doing later in the day, I'll get to those. Oh, good grief. Now I'm going to sleep down in this dusty basement. All right. So we are now on page 12. And a lot of you also ask questions about how they were able to keep all of their money. We're getting ready to do how that happened when we get into this labor issue of what was happening. And that will be um, what we're doing. Okay, so sorry, I had to look at my phone. So we're on page 12, the New South. Now, why is it the New South? And note again, it's in quotation marks. Two things to remember about this time period. The way Reconstruction ended. Reconstruction ended because of the Compromise of 1877 and wanting a president. Reconstruction didn't end because everything now is good for Black people that are freed slaves. Nothing is. In essence, it looks the same. But the problem is the South now has to reinvent itself, because how do you justify fighting a war to protect your ability to own people? It's hard. So they have to reinvent themselves. And that's what this is going to be about. This New South, even calling the war between the states, or as my granny called it, the war of northern aggression. So that's how they changed it. So again, the idea of how they can do that politically, because they have been out of politics for a while. So how do they make those changes? So to ensure its control, each southern state passed legislations taking voting rights away from Blacks. That was the first thing they did, right? They took all of these voting rights away. Even though there's an amendment that says you can't, they made up all of these laws, such as literacy test, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and we've talked about those in our last chapter. Those are legislated. Those are laws that the South put in place in order to keep African Americans from voting, because African Americans at that time were voting Republican. So, and that's a weird thing. We're going to have to see how that flip flop things, because most of the South were Democrats. So, Redeemers and Bourbons, again, powerful conservative oligarchy that controlled every Southern state government. And then at the bottom of page 12, the New South. Now, one guy, there's always that one guy who understands there's something that the South needs to do that they didn't ever do, and that's what cost them the war, is they never diversified. And so William Grady says, this is something that you guys need to do. He's a newspaper editor who urged the South to outproduce the North. We need to do something economically rather than agriculture. And nobody listens to him. They stick with agriculture. On the top of page 13, we get tobacco. What the South turns from, instead of just cotton, they're going to go cotton and tobacco. And this is the rise of that horrible Duke family called the Buchanan, Duke, and American Tobacco, which built a university not named that's built on tobacco money. So that being said, agriculture still is going to dominate. It continued to dominate. They never decided, hey, we should build some factories. When, if you remember way back in August when we did our little plot thing of where the wealthiest towns were, where the most important universities were, we had that big blank part in the South until we started putting negative things. And again, this is still a leftover thing. The sharecropping system on page 13, please don't forget about the sharecropping system. It's going to put really in servitude a whole lot of poor white people and almost all African Americans, where they're virtually tied to the land and they can't leave, and they won't be able to leave because they're stuck in this system. So at the bottom, again, this lost cause, this redemption. So instead of the Southerners remain proud of their defense in the idea of states' rights. And this is where the South rewrites history and claims it's all about states' rights. Because again, how do you say, hey, we fought a war so we can enslave people? We just change it up and make it a lost cause, our heritage, our states' rights. And again, that we all know is not what it was about. So on the top of page 14 Impact of the second industrial revolution. And you need to be able to give me this list. It is really important. Standard of living rose sharply and remained highest in the world. Even when we're talking about the poor working class, it's better than anywhere else. Their standard of living will rise as well, even though it is in no way close to what our wealthy people are going to have. It's still a rise in the standard of living. Urban centers mushroom as factories increasingly demanded more labor. American agriculture eclipsed by industrialism. This will be where we are no longer a country of farmers. We are an industrialized nation. Railroads, steel, oil, electricity. Free enterprise is eclipsed by monopoly. Workplace becomes regimented and impersonal. Women achieve social and economic dependence and independence in new careers as typing, stenography, and switchboard operating, which I'm glad a lot of you know what that is now. If you've ever seen all that moving of the things, you know what that is now. Marriages will be delayed. Women don't have to get married now for economic support, but they can work. Social stratification, again, more pronounced. By 1900, 10% of the people controlled 90% of the wealth. That's astronomical. That's absolutely incredible. 10% of the population controlled 90% of the wealth, which means 90% of the people shared 10%. That's unbelievable. And foreign trade, that's going to be really important. So here's what we look at in this same time period as this rise of industrialization. We now have a rise of the labor movement. People begin thinking, hey, we should get something as workers for making this product. And that begins the discussion of who gets what. The manufacturer, the factory owner, the person taking the risk says, hey, I'm taking the big risk here. I'm going to share my profits with you. Go work somewhere else. And the worker says, without us, you don't have a product. Now, the important part to note here is immigration. Without all of those immigrants, without millions and millions of immigrants, the workers could have put themselves in a better spot. But because there's so many of them, the manufacturer can say, go find a new job. I can find 10 people to take your job tomorrow. And so when that happens, labor is never going to be in a spot where they can change things. So that's what we're at. So conditions for workers in the second industrialization were tough. They were horrible. Um, um, they were unsanitary. They were unsafe. They were applied capital punishment. You could be hit. You could be smacked. And I'm sure it happened quite often. Automation created short term losses of jobs. Working conditions were dismal and personal. Recourse minimal in the face of the vast power of industrialists. They just had so much money. And even if you, and this is what we'll find, even when you go on strike, the only way strikes work is if it somehow hurts the manufacturer. If you're Mr. Rockefeller and you've got $900 million, how are you going to hurt him financially? That's the only way it works. And because these men had so much money and so much power, strikes aren't going to work. So, um, many are forced to sign ironclad oaths or yellow dog contracts saying they won't strike. Corporations, I'm on page 14 under 1. Look at E. Corporations sometimes owned company towns. So a company town worked very simply and very perfect. You moved in, you're going to work for Pullman, Mr. Pullman making railroad cars. He has a town. He's got his houses, he's got his store, and you move into one of his houses, you buy stuff from his stores, and all of that is just deducted from your paycheck, which works fine as long as your paycheck is worth more than the stuff that you're buying or your rent. What often happens is Mr. Pullman gets you into his houses and into his stores with credit, and then he reduces your wages. and then you can't pay for those things. And then you're in debt to the company store, you're in debt to him for your rent, and you can't quit your job because how are you going to pay those? That again is something powerful that these industrialists had. These company towns were horrible places for workers to get stuck, created a cycle of debt. This is really important, and I would highlight F. The public grew tired of frequent strikes. The public would be the middle class, right? I'm not a worker. I want to come home and get my newspaper and my mail, and all these strikes are messing that up. And so I began to see the working class not as someone I want to help, but as someone that's making my life difficult. And so I don't want to support that. We also began to see attached to these strikes the words socialism thrown in. And anytime in America we wave that socialism flag, everybody gets nervous with that. So that will be a problem as well. So at the bottom, please, labor, at bottom of page 14, labor goals of currency reform and opposition to national banks alarm conservatives. But please note, wages were the highest in the world. Those people would never have been making that much money anywhere else in the world. But at the same time, there was no place else in the world where Mr. Rockefeller could get $900 million. So, again, both things happening. So, on page 15, we have our first labor union, the National Labor Union, organized in 1866. It's a major boost to the union. It brought together skilled craft unions in one large union. Lasts about 6 years. They had 600,000 workers, and they're really focusing on very simple things: an 8-hour workday and arbitration by industrial disputes, meaning let's sit down at a table and talk about this. They succeeded in getting an 8-hour day for government workers, but laws had no means of enforcement. African Americans formed their own national union. And again, it's going to be killed by the Depression in 1870. Molly Maguires, I'd put a box around Molly Maguires because they are a very specific type of union focused around one specific job and their nationality, right? They're Irish. They're Irish coal miners. It's a secret fraternity, and they are very violent. They are part of what gives unions a really bad name at this time. They use intimidation, they burn things. They're kind of sort of like a union mob, right? Um, and the Mollies will be destroyed, its members will be hanged, and this becomes this idea of what unions are. And it will take unions a long time to overcome this idea of violence. So, our first big strike is going to be the Great Railroad Strike. And this isn't significant. There are going to be a lot of strikes in this, and you just really need to know a crucial part of how these strikes played out and the significance when all of you guys like ask me, why didn't the government stop this? You're going to see that the government plays along with these men, and that's what gives them the ability to continue to manipulate and take at the expense of workers. So it is our first nationwide strike, and it's going to paralyze the railroads. It's going to, about 100,000 workers are not going to go to work. So coal miners come in, craft workers. It involved 14 states and 10 railroads. Now, this is going to have an impact on somebody financially. This is going to make something happen. Here's what happens. Pick up the phone, Mr. Rockefeller, and he calls the President of the United States and says, hey, we need to stop this strike. Can you send out the Army? The Army, the United States Army, to put down this strike. And so President Hayes uses federal troops in Pennsylvania. 100 people are going to die. And guess what? It scares middle class people. So, what are middle class people going to think about the union? That it's violent and we don't want it. We don't want it. And so, again, unions take a step back. On the top of page 16, we have our Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor is still a union, as far as I know. I think there's a union hall for them in Terre Haute. They're not a very widely joined union because there's so many special unions. But anyway, unions. Knights of Labor is led by Terrence Powderly. He's a moderate. It was a secret society, but eventually they allow people. And this is what you need to know about the Knights of Labor. Look at F2, all workers. And the two important groups of people that they let in are African Americans, blacks, and women. There's not a lot of unions at this time that are letting in those two groups. That's really important. The only people they excluded, I like this list: liquor dealers, gamblers, lawyers, no lawyers in our union, bankers, and stockbrokers. And this, again, is really important union. It campaigned for economic and social reform, sought to replace the wage system with with workers owning the factories. That's a scary idea. What am I at? 20 minutes. Government regulation of railroads, and start arbitration. What's going to happen is this is going to, um, union is going to also have difficulty because of the Haymarket Square bombing that we are going to turn the page and see at the top of page 17. Haymarket Square bombing is going to take place in Chicago. It's May 4th. Chicago police advance on a meeting called to protest the brutalities by the police in a May Day strike. Now, what they're afraid of is some anarchists. Anarchists are people who don't believe there needs to be a government. That's what an anarchist believes. There should be no government. But they usually have a violent tendency attached to their names when you say anarchists. If you look at the real definition, it just means somebody who doesn't believe there needs to be a government, that we can run ourselves. But there usually is some kind of negative. So what happens in the middle of all this is somebody throws a pipe bomb. Don't know who. Still to this day, don't know who threw it. But what happens is it's going to kill 8 police officers. 60 will be injured. 7 or 8 civilians are going to be killed. So it was a very deadly event. And they blamed it on unions. And that instance, that becomes what most normal middle class people think about unions. Again, another violent event. 5 anarchists are going to be sentenced to death. And even though there's no proof, no one knows who did that. None at all. In 1892, the governor pardoned the 3 remaining survivors after an exhaustive study and said, "We don't know that these people did this." And obviously, he was not reelected. The rise of working men parties in various states scared conservatives who blacklisted members through employers association. So again, this is scaring conservatives. This idea of workers rising up is terrifying to that group of conservative people. At the bottom of page 17, we have the AFL, which is still around. AFL is attached most often with the CIO, American Federation of Labor, by Samuel Gompers, and this is a different type of union. This is the idea of a closed shop union, and they are only accepting skilled craftsmen. So Gompers was fairly conservative. He accepted existence of 2 workers and employers. If you look on page 18, a closed shop, everybody that was working there had to belong to the union. And again, its shortcomings, it doesn't represent unskilled labor, especially women and blacks. So then we get to our next strike called the Homestead Strike. And this is at Carnegie's steel plant. So Mr. Carnegie, he's actually off on a vacation. And this demonstrates that a strong employer could break a union if it hired a private police force and gained government and court protections. So Carnegie says, "I'm going to slash your pay 20%, which is fairly sizable." And so in what the workers did was they locked themselves inside the plant. So we're going to lock ourselves in. You're not going to be able to use this plant. Again, Mr. Carnegie has millions of dollars. But Mr. Frick hires Pinkertons, 300 Pinkerton detectives. And don't think like detectives like what we think. They're like 300 armed um, military people. I mean, this is like calling in the SEALs. So armed workers come in, they surrender. 7 workers are killed, 150 are wounded. But please look, the Pennsylvania governor brought in 8,000 state militia and scabs and break the strike. And again, union is effectively broken. Our next to the last, Pullman strike in 1894. Pullman strike, same thing. The top of page 19. This is Eugene V. Debs, and Eugene V. Debs is a very important person in Terre Haute, and he organizes the American Railway Union, about 150,000 rail workers. And again, the Attorney General is going to send federal troops for messing with the United States mail, and that again will be put down. First time the government uses an injunction to break up a strike. So all of these things are happening. All of this is going to, again, create difficulty between workers and um, manufacturers. So that's where we'll start tomorrow on urbanization. All right. So please make sure you listen to these lectures, and we will hopefully see each other on Thursday. I hope. There is an assignment. Make sure you look at it. Please make sure you're doing these. I just need to make sure that you guys are listening to these and getting information out of them. So, all right. We'll talk to you hopefully Thursday in person. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.